half diminished, minor 7 flat 5, what do you call them? I prefer to call them half diminished because it's slightly quicker to say. Although minor 7 flat 5 does tell you exactly what we're talking about today. It's a minor 7 chord with a flat and 5. So this is a funny little chord really. It's a diatonic chord to the major key, just like major chords and minor chords. Yeah, it's not nearly as common. Let's break it down and then see how and where we can use them. In my very first lesson teaching a beginner piano student, I tend to start with the C major scale and then I explain how we can build chords from each note of the scale by using the other notes within the scale, skipping a note each time to create triads. And then that shows us all the chords that exist within the major scale. So our first, our fourth and our fifth chord are major chords, our second, third and sixth are minor chords. And then I sort of gloss over this last chord on the end and say, that's a diminished triad. Don't worry about that. We won't use that much. We'll come back to it later on. And then I proceed to take all the rest of those chords, put them together to make nice chord progressions, but not using that ugly duckling, the diminished chord. So let's quickly examine how this chord is different to other chords in the major scale. So we can think of our triads as being made up of two intervals. The interval between the first and second note and the interval between the second and third note. Now a major chord, any major chord, has 4 semitones, 1, 2, 3, 4, or a major third between the first and second note, and 3 semitones, or a minor third between the second and third note. Now a minor chord, any minor chord, has that inverted. So a minor chord has 3 semitones, a minor third between its first and second note, and 4 semitones, a major third between its second and third note. Now our diminished is different. So within our key of C, our diminished chord has 3 semitones, or a minor third, between its first and second note, just like a minor chord, but it also has 3 semitones, a minor third, between its second and third note. So a major chord has a major third followed by a minor third, a minor chord has a minor third followed by a major third, and a diminished triad has a minor third followed by a minor third. Now make a point of calling it a diminished triad and not just a diminished chord, because diminished chords are very rarely played as triads. They're usually played as 4-note chords, and that fourth note is a seventh. But there are 2 types of seventh that we can add to a diminished triad. The first is the flat 7, which is what we're doing here, which creates a half-diminished chord. So it's a diminished triad with a flattened 7 on top. And the other one is a double flattened 7th. So it's not a major 7th or a flattened 7, it's a double flattened 7th. And that's our fully diminished chord, or just sometimes called a diminished 7th chord, or even sometimes it's called a diminished chord. And now that's created a symmetrical chord of minor third intervals between each note. Now, a fully diminished chord isn't diatonic to any major key. I've done a completely separate video all about diminished chords, so you should go and watch that. So the half diminished chord is diatonic to the major key. Before we had our triads within the major key, but if we add a 7th to every chord in the major key, our 7th chord is that half diminished chord. As we touched on before, this chord is also known as a minor 7 flat 5, and that's probably the best way to think about it if you quickly need to find a half diminished chord. If you need to quickly find A flat half diminished, then the best way to think about it is A flat minor 7 with a flattened 5th. It'll be the quickest way to find it. Okay, now to the good stuff. How and where we can use them. Now, half diminished chords are all over jazz music, but there are some ways that we can actually use them nicely in other styles too. So I've talked already about the fact that we've got a diatonic half diminished chord within the major scale, but it rarely gets used diatonically. And I think that's because of the fact that it's so similar to the 5 chord. So if we took our half diminished chord in the key of C, on the B, half diminished, but instead of playing the root note in the bottom, we're going to play the root note of the 5 chord. So the 5 chord in C is G. And if we look here, we've got the third, the 5th, the 7th, and the 9th of a G9 chord. So in the same way that lovely tritone of the G wants to resolve to our C, that same tritone is present in our B half diminished that wants to resolve to the C. So it functions very much like a dominant chord diatonically. But I think it's rarely used because it's not really as strong as the 5 chord. So I could play it. So it works nicely as a dominant chord, but it's just not as strong as the 5. So I don't think it gets used as much because of that reason. Another way that we can use the diatonic half-diminished chord is in a minor 2-5-1. Now minor 2-5-1s, again, they're all over jazz music, but they do crop up in plenty of other places too. Now you may be familiar with a major 2-5-1 sequence, which is a minor 7 chord on the 2nd degree of the scale, 2 chord, that leads to a dominant chord on the 5th degree of the scale, the 5 chord, which leads us to resolve on the major chord on the 1st degree of the scale, the 1 chord. And that movement creates this lovely voice leading, which just guides our ear to that resolution on the 1 chord. Now a minor 2-5-1 does exactly the same thing, but our target chord isn't a major chord, it's a minor chord. And instead of our 2 chord being a minor 7 chord, it's a minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished chord. And our 5 chord is normally some sort of altered dominant chord, like a 7 flat 9 chord. So if we stay in the key of C and we think of A minor as our target chord, now it's the 6th chord in the key of C, but if we think of that 6th chord as now a 1 chord, and we're going to approach it with the 2 and the 5, so our 2, 5, 1. So our 2 chord on the B is going to be a half diminished, and our 5 chord on the E is going to be a 7 flat 9, and then resolve to that A minor 7. So within the chord sequence, that could work like this. So you see how, again, that 2 and 5 really lead our ear to that resolution on the 1. Again, it's that voice leading our minor 7 flat 5 half diminished to the, we're just moving, we've got that movement. So nice. Now I use that example of moving to the A minor, the 6th chord, because it uses the diatonic half diminished chord. But I can use that same device, the minor 2-5-1, to move us to any of the minor chords in the major key. So if I wanted to move to the 2 chord, the D minor, within the key of C, then I could again think of that as the 1, and I'm going to use 2, 5 to approach it. So I'm going to use E half diminished, A 7 flat 9 to get to my D. That works, and the same thing works for the E minor. If I want to target the 3rd, again, if I think of that E minor as 1, and I use 2, 5, 1, so the F sharp is my 2 chord, F sharp half diminished, B 7 flat 9 to an E minor. Nice. Now while we're thinking about 2-5-1s, another popular jazz progression is just sort of an extension of that, which is like a 6-2-5-1 or 1-6-2-5-1. And now we can do the same thing in the minor key. And in that case, that 6th chord becomes a half diminished as well. So a major 1-6-2-5-1 would be 1-6-2-5-1. Now we can, just the same way that we flip that into a minor, we can do the same thing again. So we've had our minor 2-5-1 in A minor, but if we did 1-6-2-5-1, that's another common progression. Okay, nice. But there are some other really nice ways that we can incorporate half-diminished chords into our chord sequences, and this next one's probably my favourite. It's using a half-diminished chord on the second degree of our scale and using it as a sort of cadence. So it's taking our second degree of our scale, turning it into a half-diminished chord, which then resolves to the 1. So something like... How nice does that sound? There's a bunch of reasons why that works so nicely as well. That half-diminished chord is just an example of modal interchange. So it's just borrowed from the C natural minor, the parallel minor that we're in. So we're in C major, parallel minor is C natural minor. That D half-diminished is just the second chord in C minor. Also, D half-diminished is just like an F minor chord. It's an F6 chord, F minor 6 chord. And that's a really common cadence, the 4 chord to the 4 minor to the resolution on the 1. So it sounds very much like that resolution. But then also we could think of it as like a backdoor dominant. Backdoor dominant of C is a B flat 7. Now I talked earlier about how our half-diminished chords are really similar to dominant 7 chords. So our D half-diminished chord is just like a B flat 9 chord. It's got the 3rd, 5th, 7th and 9th. So it feels like a B flat chord in first inversion that resolves to a C. So it's just like a backdoor dominant. Sometimes I have to stop myself from getting too caught up in finding explanations for why things work. So while we're talking about the half-diminished being used on the second degree of the scale, there's a couple of other little things that we can do with that in the same way. When I often come to the end of a piece or some sort of cadence, I like to add in a little sort of sus thing. We can do the same thing but use the half-diminished from the second degree as the same technique. Nice. And then equally, we could just use that same sort of thing as like a vamp on the 1 chord. Nice. Right, let's quickly try and get through a few more different examples. Now, a half-diminished works really nicely in a few different ways when we use it on the flat 5 within our key. So in the key of C, if we use it on the F sharp half-diminished. We could use it as a passing chord on our way down to the 4 chord. So something like this. And that works really nicely because that 4 chord, especially if we play it as a major 7, you've got 3 notes in common to your F sharp minor, and the 4th note is only a semitone away. So we get, again, this really nice movement. Then equally, we could use that same chord as a passing chord between our 4 chord and our 5 chord. So something like this. Another common way that you'll probably have heard this half-diminished chord used on the flat 5 of the scale is in like a minor line cliche. Now typically that's written like this, but if you look at those chords in relation to their bass notes, you'll see that that 4th chord is actually a half-diminished chord. An A minor with a F sharp in the bottom is just an F sharp half-diminished. You'll have heard this tons of times in the past before, I'm sure. This one's a bit more jazz orientated. We talked earlier about 2-5-1, and we talked about a 6-2-5-1 or a 1-6-2-5-1. Now, really common at the end of jazz progressions or end of jazz standards is that you might tag round a 1-6-2-5, and then the second time round it would be a 3-6-2-5. So you might go 1-6-2-5, 3-6-2-5. 3-6-2-5-1. Now what we can do, which is really nice here, is in that second time round the sequence, instead of our 2-5, we can substitute that 2 for a half diminished on the flat 5 and substitute our 5 for a minor 7 on the 4. So that would sound like... magic. Right, this is the last one for you, and this one isn't specifically about using it on a flat 5 in the key. This one we're going to use the half diminished functioning as a secondary dominant chord. If you don't know what secondary dominant chords are, I've made a separate video all about them, which you should watch as soon as you've stopped watching this video. I've already talked a couple of times in this video about how similar half diminished chords are to dominant chords, and with that being so, they can function as such too. So using secondary dominant chords, we can lead our ear to any chord within our key. So if I'm in the key of C and I want to move to an F chord, I can precede that F chord with its secondary dominant to help move the ear towards that sound. So the dominant of F is C, so C7, so I can play C, then the secondary dominant, which moves my ear nicely to that place. Now, we know that for every dominant chord, there's a half diminished chord which contains most of those notes. So that's C7. If I take the root out of that C9 chord, I've got an E half diminished there. So I could use an E half diminished functioning as a secondary dominant instead of a C chord or C7. It works seamlessly. You could think of it as a C9 in first inversion, but effectively you're playing an E half diminished. So equally, if I wanted to move to A minor, say, I would use the secondary dominant of A, which would be an E7, and I'd use E7 secondary dominant to move me to my A minor. But that E7, I know that an G sharp half diminished is just an E9 chord without the root in it. So I could use So another way to think about it is whatever our target chord is, if we play a half diminished chord, a semitone below it, then that's going to lead us into that target chord. So if we were to take aim for G as our target chord in the key of C, then a half diminished, a semitone below, F sharp half diminished, is going to lead us to a G because it has the chord tones of a D7 or D9. So and that works for all the chords within the key. That same technique. Okay, there you go. I appreciate there were quite a few different sort of thoughts and approaches there, and I did rifle through some of them quite quickly towards the end. So hopefully you were able to follow along. If not, I guess you're just going to have to watch it all again. Thanks for being here.